really dirty. Just preemptively, we're going to get rid of some of this stuff, just because it's already a bit of a mess. Look at that. Pretty messy. Pretty impressive that this thing's still ticking, honestly. I swear it's an enigma. Whenever you get something really clean and it just stops randomly and you can't figure out why, you look at a movement like this and it just baffles your mind. Okay, to get the dial off, got some little dial screws here that need to be loosened. You just want to lightly coax this dial off. You don't want to pry too hard. There's the dial. Pretty clean shape compared to everything else. When you're looking at this dial side, there's a few parts that are always loose. If you have a dial washer, this is to prevent the minute wheel from, hour wheel from popping up and getting out of place. You want to remove that, along with that hour wheel. You tell on the dial side, we've got a FEF 210 movement. FEF did some really nice movements. They were high quality, but not overly expensive. Okay. Before we get to work, I'm going to retighten these dial screws. It's a good idea to retighten the dial screws after you take the dial off, just because they can get a little bit loose, unsurprisingly, and sometimes kind of fall out of the movement when it's going through the cleaning process, and finding them is not always easy, so better to just avoid that issue to begin with. So now you can see that there's some residual tension in the mainspring. It's obvious now because this watch is ticking, but you'll generally always want to make sure that the mainspring is unwound fully. Otherwise, you risk damage to the movement when you take things apart, because if there's still tension, obviously these little parts can go flying, or they can intersect with each other in a negative way that can cause a big problem. Usually I recommend just holding on to the stem or in the crown when letting down the mainspring, but since it's a split stem, I find it a little bit better, as long as it's not crazy wound up, to just get a nice thick screwdriver and sort of use that to slowly and controlled let down that mainspring. Okay, so we are going to start by removing the balance bridge. It's always a good move. It's obviously, the balance is really delicate, and you don't want to mess with things while that's still on there. When you're starting out, a good technique to get the balance bridge off is actually to first check if it's wiggly or not. If it's wiggly, this won't work, but if it's on there pretty securely, very carefully flip the movement over, and then you can actually release the bridge by just loosening a little bit while it's upside down, and then letting the bridge and balance kind of just fall out of the movement. If it gets stuck, you can very gently rotate it one way or another, and it'll come loose. But that's a really good way to be able to remove the balance and still be able to pick up the bridge in a controlled way. We're not going to mess with the hairspring. Next is to remove the pallet. And you want to very carefully vertically pick that up. Examine it for any cracks or chips. I like to give the pallets a little bit of a wipe down with pith wood. It's very soft. Get rid of anything kind of stuck on them. And then to use pith wood to clear those pivots a little bit, just of any debris that might be left on there. When you rub the pallet stones on pith wood to kind of clear them off, it's actually a good way to test too that they're nice and securely in there. Because if they're not securely in there and you put it back together and they get out of line or they fall out, then it's going to be a big headache. I'm going to remove this stem, split stem. Get rid of some of this gunk on it. Here's how a split stem works. This part, the male part of the split stem, goes into the female part of the stem and it sort of clicks into place. But obviously when enough pressure is applied, you can pull it apart. And this is kind of a waterproofing method they used to use a lot. It's not necessarily the best method because parts kind of wear out this way, but that's how they did it and that's how it works. Next, I like to remove the ratchet wheel. It's a good idea to use screwdrivers that are as close to the size of the screw as possible. Just gives you better torque and means you're less likely to break off the tips of your screwdrivers or slip and scratch things. When you remove the click, make sure to lift vertically if you can. It's because there's a spring under there and you really don't want to fling it somewhere. It's very small and very hard to find. You can take my word for it. It's really important to note that with the crown wheel, the threading is almost always reversed. This is because based on the direction of winding a watch, if it was the correct threading, it might loosen itself over time. This is just kind of like a protective measure. When there's a single screw in there, it's almost always reverse threaded. If there's two, obviously it wouldn't be able to spin, so don't worry about that. But, for a watch like this, when you see this in the crown wheel, this makes sense that the crown goes right here. Here's the crown wheel. You want to do right to loosen it, not righty-tighty. Before removing the other bridges, you're going to want to get that cannon pinion removed. Cannon pinion is the center piece right here. It's a friction fit piece that basically allows you to set the time, but it's still friction fit enough that it won't spin when the time is just running as it should be. To remove this, you can either use tweezers and pry. If you do that, be really careful if there's a sub-second hand because that little pivot there will bend very easily. I have a great little tool. It's a cannon pinion remover. basically pinches and pulls the cannon pinion off. And even when you're using this, you want to watch out for that sub-seconds pivot. Voila, comes off very easily. Hopefully not too easily, because then you'll need to tighten it, but that one felt just about right. While we're here, we're going to remove the keyless works. When you remove the keyless works, you want to be really careful. This clutch lever spring is usually in there pretty darn tight, and if you move anything you're not supposed to in the wrong order, it will very much want to fly very quickly and very far. So when you remove that, you want to place a piece of pegwood over it, over that circular part of it, to sort of create a way to lock it in with a piece of pegwood. And then when it flings out of there, it's going to be retained by that piece of pegwood and stay right with you. Okay, now it's about time to remove that bridge. This cap jewel here, not a lot of watches of this type won't have these cap jewels, but when they do, I find it easier to remove that cap jewel while it's still on the plate, just because you're not very likely to mess anything up just by removing it while it's there. I just put these really tiny screws back in the plate a lot of the time. They're just so easy to lose that it's not really worth the hassle of trying to put them through the cleaning machine, especially when the amount of cleaning that can be done on them is so negligible. It's probably not best practice to do, but it's a pretty safe bet, and that's what I do. And fight me if you don't like it. Just kidding, please don't fight me. I'm just comparing the lengths of the screws in the plate. Sometimes near the keyless works, one of the plate screws will be a little bit shorter, and it's really important that you put it back in the right place if that is the case, but these are all the same length. Again, when I first clear these off, I'll use kind of a junky Rodico just to get any, obviously gummed up pieces off of there. And then you really, if it's gummed up like this one is, you really just got to get deep in there with pegwood and clear it out. As you can see, the leaves are absolutely filthy, and you'll need to get in there and clean with a really sharp piece of pegwood. Make sure you get every little bit of that out. along with the gear teeth, of course. But if you don't do that, the cleaning machine just might not eat all of it away. It might, maybe you'll get lucky, but it probably won't. And then you're going to be doing a lot of cleaning for a watch that still stops every once in a while. So it's really important to get deep in there. It's important to note that Rodico is definitely not infallible, and especially a dirty one can leave little bits stuck to pieces. So it's really important before you put them in your parts basket that you do double check that nothing's stuck to it. You want to make sure before cleaning that all the jewels are pegged. And pegging jewels is basically you use peg wood to gently clear them out and make sure that any little bits of crusted oil or debris are removed from that pivot hole. If you don't get out those little bits of debris or dried oil or anything like that, it can cause some pretty significant wear to parts. So it's definitely good practice to go through before cleaning and peg all of those, any kind of hole where there's a pivot. So usually a good method to remove this plate of the barrel is to get some kind of screwdriver, stick it up there, and kind of pry it up. Since this is such a small hole, and the only thing I have really small enough to fit in there is pretty sharp metal, which could potentially cause problems with the mainspring if I'm able to reuse this one. I actually will set the barrel on a very hard flat surface, and then I'll actually use my fingernails to press down on the gears, firmly, but in a controlled manner. You don't want to really bend anything, and you probably won't if you do it in a nice steady way with even pressure as much as you can. You can see that whoever serviced this last put, in my opinion, much too much, looks like oil instead of grease, but much too much in there in my opinion. So we'll give that a good cleaning and get that out of there before we reinsert it. You'll want to note, before you remove the mainspring, you'll want to note the direction that the mainspring travels from this barrel arbor here. You can see here that it goes in a clockwise direction, and occasionally you'll find a watch that goes in counterclockwise direction. Sometimes automatic movements have that more frequently than like a manual wind. Okay, so when you remove this, you might want to check, keep your finger over the rest of the mainspring. See if that arbor is really loose or not. In this case, it's not. You want to use brass tweezers. It's really important. These are kind of my junkier brass tweezers. They've got better points, so try not to judge me, but I wouldn't blame you if you did. I use these a lot for mainsprings, and you just gently start releasing that mainspring, but you have to be really careful to keep your thumbs on the edges. And as you start kind of coaxing it out of the barrel, it'll start unwinding itself. And you just want to be really, slow, steady, and controlled. Otherwise, this thing can, really jet across the room or flick you in the eye, and you don't want that. And bingo, there we have it. Mainspring is out. Good way to get this arbor out if it's really tight is to get it over a hole on your block and kind of push it through. You want to be careful the hole is about the same size as the arbor, otherwise you could bend the mainspring. You don't want to do that. And voila, we'll get it out of there. This mainspring it looks to be in pretty good condition. And I'm optimistic that we can reuse it when we service the watch. I try to use the same mainspring for originality's sake on these vintage watches when possible. It doesn't really matter if you have a replacement one; it's probably better to do. But when you can, and as long as it's still strong enough, that's what I'll personally do. So a technique that I'll use to kind of minimize risk when cleaning these old movements is I'll actually clean the watch with the balance installed. It really only kind of works with Inca block to do it this way, or if it's not Inca block, you have to take it all apart to begin with and then put it back together, which really isn't worth the hassle. But since you got an Inca block system here, that's a shock absorbing jewel system. That's what this little thing is here. If you're able to remove the jewels and give them a cleaning, reinstall them, and wash the plate with the balance and the balance bridge installed, it still does a pretty good job of cleaning the balance, but it minimizes the risk of messing with the hairspring. Again, this is probably not 100% best practice. It's what I do for Inca block watches, but obviously I would expect Patek Philippe to not do this. But if you're learning, if you're trying to get your watch to work, this is probably a pretty safe bet that it's going to go okay. But again, you want to make sure that those jewels are clean before you put them back in there, because there's no point in putting it through the wash if there's a lot of stuff stuck inside it already. As you can see, this Inca block system, it's on a little hinge. This little spring holds the balance jewel and the cap jewel in place, but it also allows for a little bit of give if the watch were to be dropped, so that this can wiggle a little bit. It's not all completely rigid. So now that I've got the watch completely disassembled, it's ready to clean. I'm going to put it through a 3-jar L&R Master cleaning machine. I'll make a video at some point about how to use that. They're pretty straightforward, but they're a really useful machine. So we're going to put it through a cycle. There's a cleaning cycle, a rinse cycle, a second rinse cycle, and a drying cycle. Before, like what we were doing with the with the Rodico and kind of taking things apart carefully, and the pegwood and the pithwood. It's basically, before you put it through the cleaning machine, you want it to be a clean movement effectively. You want it to be as clean as you can get it before you even put it in the cleaning machine. This just means that once it's through the cleaning cycle, it's going to be really pristine and perfect. And I honestly feel like I could put together this watch right now just after the basic cleaning job I've done now, and it would probably run pretty well. But obviously we want to get it to its maximum potential, so we're going to put it through this cleaning process, and hopefully this goes smoothly. We'll see what happens.